Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
On this Monday after the news broke, we turn now to Seth Harris, former labor policy advisor to President Biden and senior fellow at the Burns Center. Seth, it's great to have you with us here at the table. Thank you for joining. You probably know Joe Biden better than anyone else we're going to talk to on the program today. And so I don't want to get too personal here, but I do. And what motivated him? Was the pressure too great for him to wait to speak to the American people, to do this in his own time, at his own pace from the Oval Office? All we still have is a piece of letterhead.
Well, the defining character trait of Joe Biden, at least in his public life, has been resilience. He has suffered unfathomable personal losses. He has suffered professional setbacks that would have caused a lot of other people to go and lie in the fetal position on their beds. But he has always persevered, he has always continued, and he's always gone to work for the people he grew up with in Claymont, Delaware, and in Scranton, Pennsylvania, the middle-class, working-class families that he cares about so much, that he identifies with, and his family was that kind of a family. Mm-hmm. But there's an even more important trait about Joe Biden, and that is patriotism. He sees Donald Trump, I think correctly, and the Republican Party as an existential threat to democracy in the United States. And when he sat down with his top aides, Steve Ricchetti and Mike Donilon, and they showed him the data that showed that it was going to be very difficult for him to stop Donald Trump, he chose country over party, country over self, which, as you all know from doing this television show here in Washington, D.C., when you talk to a lot of politicians, that's not what politicians usually do. He chose to do the right thing for the country and for the working people of this country at great cost to himself. And I don't think it was that the pressure, I don't think it was the donors saying, we're not going to give you any money. It was that he cares about winning for working people. He cares about winning for democracy. It was, for me, personally, a very deeply sad day, but I've never been prouder of the man. And it's been my privilege to work with him in 2 administrations. He's a remarkable human being, and it's been my honor to be associated with him.
Well, it's a great reminder to us all, Seth, of just what Joe Biden has been as a public servant. We're talking half a century through surviving the loss of his wife, his daughter, eventually his son, Beau, continuing to serve through it all. But of course, yesterday, not just a decision to no longer continue that service, at least in the presidential capacity, but a second decision that quickly followed his announcement to endorse Kamala Harris as someone he thinks should take the helm and be the Democratic nominee. How do you view that part of this decision-making process for Joe Biden? Because we'd had a lot of conversation in the week since the debate about how he needed convincing that Kamala could beat Trump if he could not. So should we rule that the polling suggested that Kamala could do it, or just that Joe Biden thought it would be the right thing to do to back up his vice president?
I think it's both. He saw polling that showed that not only that she can win, but that it's likely that she is going to be able to win. But also, he's deeply loyal to her. He picked her when he didn't have to pick her. And he positioned himself as a transitional figure in the Democratic Party, ushering in a new generation of Democrats who are going to carry the progressive values that he's lived his entire life forward. He has an agenda that he wants to see finished. He talks about finishing the job. He knows that she is the best situated person to do that.
It's been noted that Joe Biden is a hugger, that he likes to surround himself with people, his friends, his coworkers, his staff in this case, but he's had COVID and has been dealing with a very difficult environment as he comes to this decision. Has this been a depressing experience, a dark time for him? How would you describe it?
You know, I haven't spoken to him during this period, and I haven't spoken to the people immediately around him, understandably. They're focused inward, not focused outward. Mm-hmm. But, you know, I having experienced COVID myself and sitting in a house alone without your family, although he does have Dr. Biden there with him, although she's in a separate bedroom to keep her safe. It is difficult, particularly when you're trying to do business and you're not feeling especially well. But look, he's an amazingly tough man. I mean, he's made it to the age of 81 at the very peak of his profession, and he has accomplished remarkable things for this country. He lifted us out of a pandemic. He drove the economy to the best economy we've seen since the 1960s. He assembled a coalition to fight tyrants and to defend democracy all around the world. He's fighting democracy at home. He's been remarkably accomplished, even though he has experienced this illness now and he's experienced some physical setbacks otherwise. It's really an admirable record, and that's what he wanted to continue, and he was convinced that he could.
Well, you talk about an admirable record on the economy, and yet polling does suggest that he has not gotten credit for that. Voters do not feel good about the Biden economy. Can Harris message that differently than Biden, make that a narrative that works for her, do something that the president could not?
I think that there's going to be a lot of time and a lot of money spent making the case, comparing the Biden economy, now the Harris economy, to the Trump economy. President Trump is the first president since Herbert Hoover to leave office with fewer jobs than when he entered office. President Biden has set records for the number of jobs that have been created under his watch. Unemployment set a 50-year record at a low level below 4%. Real wages rising for working families. The bottom quarter of working families, the bottom quarter of incomes, seeing a dramatic increase in their real wages as well. The big issue has been prices. Even though inflation has come down dramatically and is barely hovering above what the Federal Reserve tells us is their policy target, again, not handed down from Sinai on tablets. But even though inflation has come down, prices are still too high. And that's what the American people are reacting to. So I think that the vice president will be able to talk about all of the accomplishments and the dramatic threat to our country that's posed by the Trump administration. The sales pitch will be very simply that the vice president and President Biden care about working people and whether or not their lives come out well. The other side can't make the same case.
Let's talk about the issue we associate you most closely with, and that's organized labor. Joe Biden professed to be the most union-friendly president in American history. We know that he's struggled with the rank and file to some extent, but won the endorsement of Sean Fain in the UAW. It's been a little bit of a different relationship with the Teamsters. We just saw Sean O'Brien speaking in Milwaukee, as a matter of fact. Kamala Harris walked a picket line, I think, in 2019. What is her relationship with organized labor? Is this going to be the same campaign when it comes to unions?
Let me say President Biden is the most pro-union president, I would argue, in history, and the labor movement understands that, and that's why the AFL-CIO and a couple of dozen unions endorsed him earlier than they have ever endorsed any presidential candidate before. Vice President Harris doesn't have 50 years of history with organized labor in the way that President Biden does. She's newer to national politics, but during her time as vice president, she's been very deeply involved with organized labor. She chaired the White House Task Force on Worker Organizing and Worker Empowerment. That's where she and I work together most closely. She has spoken at conventions. She most recently spoke at the convention of Unite Here, which is the hospitality union. She spoke at the convention of the Service Employees International Union, which has already endorsed her. She has very effective and close working relationships with a number of national union leaders. They know her, they trust her. And my prediction is that every union that has endorsed President Biden will go forward through their democratic processes and ultimately endorse Vice President Harris. And the reason is they want this pro-union, pro-worker, bottom-up, middle-out economic strategy to continue. And Vice President Harris is the most likely candidate to be able to do that.
And yet, when you listen to the Republicans, especially the vice presidential nominee on that side, J.D. Vance, in his acceptance speech, he specifically called out the working men in places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, those Rust Belt states that he's trying to appeal to. In what way does the Harris and whomever campaign, assuming that she's the top of the ticket, need to counter that narrative that is also coming from the Republicans? They're competing for the same batch of voters here.
Yeah, all they have to do is tell the truth about J.D. Vance's record and Donald Trump's record. Donald Trump was the most anti-union president in the modern history of the United States. J.D. Vance has opposed every piece of legislation that would empower working people so that they can improve the quality of their lives that has been presented to him. They do not want working class populism. They don't want to put power in the hands of working people so that they can have a say in their workplaces and have a say in their communities. They want to make corporations bow down to government. That's their version of populism because they view themselves as speaking for the American people, a couple of guys out of the Ivy League trying to represent the working class. That's not the truth. Unless you are involved in putting forward an agenda that empowers workers by allowing them to build power through democratic organizations like unions, you're not for working class power in America.
The narrative right now is that Donald Trump is more concerned about running against Kamala Harris than he was against Joe Biden. The narrative a minute ago, 5 minutes ago maybe, is Joe Biden's the only person who can beat Donald Trump. Does this actually change the calculus for Donald Trump? Can she beat him more easily than Joe Biden, in your view?
Well, I think it does change the calculus. They have organized their entire campaign around running against President Biden, and age was their best argument
so she
against President Biden.
Immediately turns the table on the age issue.
Absolutely. And she is an extraordinarily effective campaigner. Let me say, as somebody who has been put in what we call the witness chair when I was briefing her, when she would ask some really tough, formidable questions when you were briefing her on whatever topic it was. I'd happen to be labor for me. So he's going to encounter that. If he has the courage to debate her, I think he's going to back out of the debates because at bottom he's really quite cowardly. And he also doesn't, let me also add one other piece to this calculus. Donald Trump has a sort of difficult relationship with women. And the idea that he is going to go toe-to-toe with a former prosecutor who is a woman and a person of color, I think that he's pretty worried about that.
All right, Seth, it's great to have you join us on this day of days. Seth Harris, former labor policy advisor to President Biden and senior fellow at the Burns Center. Great to have you reflecting on the legacy of the president as well.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
The world was rocked yesterday with the announcement of Joe Biden that he is not seeking re-election, instead endorsing his Vice President Kamala Harris to be the Democratic nominee. We are watching history being made in real time, especially when we consider that in the endorsement of Kamala Harris, which many other high-profile Democrats, including some of the governors we thought may toss their own hats into the ring for the nomination, that she is a woman and a woman of color, who is now potentially going to be the top of the ticket for one of the major parties in this election cycle.
Yeah, you've got an historic candidacy, at least on the verge of being made official here, Kailey. And as we were discussing with Seth a short time ago, potentially changed the calculus for Donald Trump, who did run against a woman in Hillary Clinton. But this is a very different case in a very different election against a backdrop of very different politics in America. Well,
and I actually raised the parallel to 2016 yesterday in our special coverage with former Congresswoman Jane Harman and asked her if America wasn't necessarily ready for a female president then, are we ready for one now?
Absolutely. America was ready for a female president the last time. Hillary narrowly lost, sadly. And I think some campaign choices that she made were responsible for that. She didn't go to the Midwest. She stayed on the coast. I don't think Kamala Harris will make those mistakes.
This is something we're going to be talking about a lot over the course of the hour. Coming up with our panel, by the way, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano are with us as we try to pick through the pieces here. The endorsements, though, hard to argue with, to your point, Kailey, and we're hearing from a number of state delegations to the Chicago convention. We can add Florida to the list. But none of this is official yet, and there are still a lot of questions about what process the party will follow in making this nomination real.
Yeah, of course, we have 4 weeks to go until the actual convention, which begins August 19th in Chicago, and 99% of the pledged delegates were pledged to Joe Biden. Now, some of the delegations, including the likes of New Hampshire, Tennessee, North and South Carolina, have chosen otherwise with Biden's decision.
Sure. Now, of course, there's going to be a big debate about the legal ramifications here. Some Republicans think that this could be blocked in court. And the idea that this was somehow a setup or an abandonment of 14 million voters. It's interesting as the talking points come together on both sides of the aisle.
Certainly. But certainly the endorsements and the money are coming together on the Democratic side of the aisle, as we have been discussing. More than $50 million raised by Kamala Harris in just the 7 hours after her announcement that she does intend to win and earn the Democratic nomination. And there could be more money thrown at her. Emily's List, which, of course, is a group that focuses on getting women into elected office. It's the largest PAC that's focused on that effort. Yesterday pledged to spend at least $20 million to support Harris's bid for the presidency. So let's turn now to Jessica Mackler. She is president of Emily's List to have more on her reaction to the event. So obviously making a big financial commitment to Vice President Kamala Harris. Have you seen an influx in donations? Can you just describe what the last 24 hours have been like for you, Jessica?
Well, this is an incredible time and a real momentous moment for this country. And I think what we've seen in the last 24 hours, not even 24 hours, is a true outpouring of support all over the country. Every region, leaders at all levels of the ballot, organizations. For us, this was an easy call. It wasn't just a day one endorsement. It was an hour one endorsement. We've been with Vice President Harris throughout her career, and we are thrilled to stand with her as she takes the helm at the top of the ticket. There is no one who is more stronger on the issue of reproductive freedom and abortion rights. That is what is going to decide this election. So what we are seeing is truly that enthusiasm and excitement for Vice President Harris's candidacy, and we're thrilled to stand with her.
Jessica, how important will it be to get Nancy Pelosi behind this effort? How soon does that need to happen?
Well, look, I think, like I said, what we have seen is an outpouring of support for the vice president from all over the country.
You think it's inevitable?
Well, I'm not going to speak. No one's going to speak for Nancy Pelosi. But like I said, you can see that there is an outpouring of support across this country for Vice President Harris. There is no one who is more ready to win this campaign against Donald Trump. And there is no one who is more prepared to lead this country than Vice President Harris.
Well, Jessica, I'd like to ask you the same question I asked Jane Harman last evening, which is that we have seen specifically Donald Trump run against a female candidate before. Hillary Clinton did that in 2016. What does Kamala Harris need to do to make sure that this election ultimately doesn't end up like 2016 with a victory for Donald Trump?
Well, look, I think one of the things we have to understand, and we've been doing at Emily's List research on the vice president for this past year and have been with her for many years. So I'm going to, take this on looking forward. And what I know, based on that research, based on the work that we've done for the vice president, is that she is well equipped to litigate this case against Donald Trump. The research that we have done shows that when we talk about the vice president's record on issues like reproductive freedom, she is so compelling to voters, the voters that we need to turn out and win in November, young voters, women, voters of color. When we talk to them about her record and the work that she has done over the course of her career in standing up on reproductive freedom and other issues, they come to this ticket. And we expect that that's what's going to happen in November. I will also say that we know, and we've seen since the Dobbs decision, that when we put a clear choice in front of voters around the stakes on abortion rights, when we talk to them about what is in front of them in these elections, Democrats win. And we're going to do that again with our best messenger on abortion rights in Vice President Harris.
Jessica, I wonder what you make of some of the rhetoric that we're already hearing surrounding a potential Kamala Harris candidacy here, a Harris campaign. You know that it's been sport here in Washington to mispronounce her name on a regular basis, which Donald Trump continues to do. Chris LaCivita, the co-manager of the campaign, issued a statement saying that Trump survived an assassin's bullet. The last thing we're worrying about is Laughin' Kamala. That's apparently going to be the nickname that Donald Trump uses going forward here. There's another one that I heard that isn't worth repeating. I just wonder to what extent she should acknowledge this.
Well, look, as you've just outlined, there are going to be some really gross racist and sexist attacks against the vice president. We've already seen that. We know that Republicans are going to do that. And so that is something that at Emily's List, we have fought back against for a long time, the disinformation, the misinformation that we know women of color candidates in particular are targets of. I have to tell you that Republicans are doing this because they are terrified about Kamala Harris. They are terrified to face such an accomplished and prepared candidate who is going to be able to effectively litigate a case on an issue that we know is going to win this election, abortion rights. But not just that. They are terrified of a candidate who is ready to lead on day one. For the past 3 years, she has been on a national stage. She has cultivated relationships with world leaders. She has delivered economic relief for people across this country. She has an incredible record throughout her career of fighting for people. So they're scared, and they are going to resort to the tactics that they always resort to in these times, and they are going to resort to these racist and sexist attacks. We are going to push back against those, and we're going to do the work of amplifying her voice. And we know that when we do that, voters will be compelled to vote for her, and we will win.
Well, Jessica, of course, at Emily's List, while you are going to be throwing your support behind Kamala Harris's presidential ambitions, your wider mission is to get Democratic women elected into office at all levels of the U.S. government. Knowing what we have learned in the last 24 hours, the notion that concern about Democrats being able to retain control of the Senate or get control of the House, the down-ballot implications had a factor in Joe Biden's decision. Would Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket actually help some of those vulnerable Democrats that we're watching, like Senator Tammy Baldwin or Senator Jackie Rosen? How do you view that?
Well, first of all, I'll say that the electric energy that we're feeling in the Democratic Party right now is incredibly helpful. It is the jolt that we need to get back to a conversation that we know is what is going to decide this election. That we need to have a conversation with voters that is consistent and clear about the choice that they are facing in this election. And that is true at every level of the ballot. We talk to voters about the stakes on abortion rights and reproductive freedom, the choice that they have between a ticket that is going to defend and restore those rights, and Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, who would enact a national abortion ban, who signed on for these awful state abortion bans that are in place right now, and for the most dangerous elements of Project 2025. Voters are clear that they will stand with us. And that choice, when we put it in front of voters, whether we're talking about a state legislative race, a U.S. Senate race, or the race for the presidency, we know Democrats will be successful if that's the conversation we're having. And that's exactly what we're going to do between now and November.
It appears that Marianne Williamson is going to take a swing at the nomination if given the opportunity. Jessica says she will compete for the spot after previously leaving the race and getting back into the race. Should she be given that chance?
Well, look, I think this is a democracy, but what we've seen from in the last 24 hours is just an incredible show of support for Vice President Harris. We have seen that from, as I've said, every region of the country, elected officials at all levels of the ballot. We've seen it from organizations that are on a whole wide range of issues. And they all know what I know, which is that there is no one more prepared to win this election against Donald Trump. There was no one who is more prepared to lead this country on day one than Kamala Harris. So I fully expect that Kamala Harris is going to be our Democratic nominee, and she is going to win in November and will be in the White House at this time next year.
Well, Jessica, of course, if she is the top of the ticket, someone needs to be on that ticket with her. I've heard suggestions in the last 24 hours that if it is to be Kamala Harris, a woman of color who is leading the Democratic ticket, that it's going to need to be a white man on it with her to balance things out. What do you think of that notion? Should she be considering a woman like Governor Gretchen Whitmer to be her vice president if she wins the nomination?
Well, I'm not going to put my own parameters out there for the vice president. I trust her to make the decision that's right for her, to choose a partner who is going to serve admirably with her and is going to be the right partner for her in this ticket. But I will say that regardless of who she chooses, we know that that ticket is going to provide a really clear contrast with Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, who embrace the most extreme elements of the Republican Party and the MAGA movement. And this is going to be a clear choice between a ticket that is going to stand up and defend our rights and our freedoms, that is going to be for a better economic future for our country, and a choice between Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, who, as I said, embrace the most dangerous elements of Project 2025 and are going to take this country down a really dark path. That's the choice voters are going to have in front of them, regardless of who is on this ticket with us. That is going to be the choice in November.
Jessica, I want to get back to something that we were talking about a bit earlier, and that's just the change in stakes for Donald Trump to be debating a woman, and in this case, a woman of color, and lessons learned from the 2016 race in which Donald Trump shared a stage with Hillary Clinton. What do you expect to see if Donald Trump actually makes good on this debate appointment that he had with Joe Biden? I realize that he might want a different venue at this point, but if something takes place in a debate between these two candidates, how does this change the game for Donald Trump?
Well, I am sure that Donald Trump and his team have seen what I've seen, and that is a lifetime and a record of achievement from Kamala Harris, and just an incredible litigator. Her background as a prosecutor, we saw it in the U.S. Senate on display in the Judiciary Committee. No one wants to be in her line of sight when it comes to having to defend a record that the American people are clear that they don't want. And so I expect that they have to be pretty scared of that moment. She's an incredibly effective messenger on issues, including reproductive freedom, but certainly not limited to that. And it is going to be a daunting task for them. She's going to litigate this case incredibly effectively against Donald Trump.
Well, Jessica, you've mentioned reproductive freedom a few times during this conversation. It was a conversation that notably wasn't really being had in Milwaukee, where Joe and I were last week. And a lot of the discussions we were having with people gathered there and strategists was this notion that the Republican Party, and especially Donald Trump in selecting J.D. Vance as his vice presidential nominee, seems to have decided not to go for suburban women in this election cycle, to focus on rural areas, working class men in particular. Do you think having Harris at the top of the ticket may actually change that strategy, and you have to counter what could be a more concerted effort with the Republicans and the Trump campaign to go after that same base of voters?
Well, I will say, I mean, watching the RNC last week, I know that Republicans like Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, they can read polls and they don't want to talk about this issue. But unfortunately for them, this is not a branding problem for them. It's an agenda problem. And it doesn't matter where you are in this country. We have seen since the Dobbs decision in red states, purple states, all over this country, people believe overwhelmingly that these are decisions that belong with individuals, that they should be able to make them themselves, their private medical choices, and that these are decisions that the government, bureaucracy, courts should not be involved in. They are very clear on that. Voters are very clear on that. And so the problem for Donald Trump and J.D. Vance and Republicans like them up and down the ticket is that you can run, but you cannot hide from this. We know their records. We're going to put that in front of voters. And wherever you are, again, around the country, they are on the wrong side of this issue.
Jessica, it's great to have you. Jessica Mackler, the president of Emily's List, America's largest PAC devoted to electing Democratic women, and in this case, devoting $20 million to the Kamala Harris for President campaign. It's great to have you here. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington alongside Kailey Leinz, where we have two major endorsements dropping in our laps here from the Senate. Kailey, Kamala Harris already had a majority of Senate Democrats, and she adds two more.
Yeah, the list is getting longer, including the senator from Maryland, Chris Van Hollen, out with an endorsement. And also, interestingly, Senator John Fetterman of Pennsylvania, who had been one of the most vocal advocates for Joe Biden, the president, staying in the race, now out with a post on X that he is proud to support and be all in for the next president. He says Kamala Harris attached as a picture that says, "Let's win this, Harris for president."
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Pollster Frank Luntz, founder and president of FIL Inc., who is here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio. Frank, great to see you. You were on with us months ago talking about how Joe Biden was not going to be able to win this election because he is too old. The age issue potentially taken away if Harris is at the top of the ticket. She's only 59. Can she beat Donald Trump? Does the data suggest right now that she can?
Yes, she can. I've already done an op-ed for the Financial Times, for the Times of London. This campaign, for me anyways, begun 24 hours or 18 hours ago. The age issue is now a Trump issue. It's not that it's been taken away. Now Trump has to defend some of the things that he spoke of because he would be the oldest person ever elected if he were to serve 4 years. She changes the entire equation. She brings young women to the table who had no interest in voting for Joe Biden and were not attracted to Donald Trump. She brings African Americans who are completely disinterested in this campaign. And these matter in states across the country. I wrote just 72 hours ago that unless things dramatically changed, it was going to be Trump, that you can now pretty well declare him because not only was he winning the swing states, but he had the passion, the energy, the intensity of vote. Every Trump supporter is going to be a Trump voter, for sure. And that was not the same with Biden. Now that it's Harris, everything changes, and I can't call it. And I can't wait for that debate. And by the way, I will pay money. I will seriously donate $10,000 right now. If ABC News hosts that debate and you let me sit in the studio, I will pay $10,000 to ABC News' or Bloomberg or
I was going to say, I'd like to host that debate. Frank, what about me and Joe?
Yes, I'd love you guys to do it because at least I could get into the building because that would be the most just contentious debate ever. These two candidates don't like each other, don't respect each other, and have no hesitation to express it. We're going to have the most negative campaign in the history of American politics, and I want a front row seat.
So this turns the race completely here, in your view. Kamala Harris has been beset with low favorability ratings. She has been laden with a difficult portfolio. Until recently, the abortion issue has played in her favor based on some of our polling, as opposed to the border. Americans think they know Kamala Harris. Do they actually? What will they learn about her in the weeks ahead?
She has the chance to redefine herself. Everything starts fresh.
So start from scratch.
You start from scratch and how she presents herself. I brought this up yesterday, the laughter that she would use, and I was criticized for saying it. Why is it that women get yelled at for laughing? Well, the fact is, in so many interviews, back to back to back, you can see it on YouTube, this is what she does when she gets asked a tough question. That's number one. Number two is she wouldn't go to the border for month after month after month. As Republican House members, Republican senators were going down to make it an issue, she stayed away because she knew that it was toxic for her. Number three, she never created a separate identity from Joe Biden. And number four, quite frankly, she went through staff pretty darn fast. And that tells you something about the character of an individual. None of that matters now. It's all from this point forward. She has the chance to redo herself. And you can see by the $50 million raised in one day in small donations how significant this decision was. This race is on Monday, whatever date this is, the race begins again with 100 days to go.
Well, I wonder here how high the bar is for her, because we've talked so much during this cycle about double haters who didn't want Trump or Biden, or the Nikki Haley primary voters who were decidedly not voting for Donald Trump even after she had abandoned her presidential campaign. How easy is the conversion from a double hater or Nikki Haley voter to potentially a Kamala Harris voter?
It's not easy, but it can happen. And what's particularly important in this is that the numbers are so small. There was only 4% undecided before Harris became the likely Democratic nominee. Now it's probably up to 6 or 7% as people take a look at her. You don't have to swing that many voters to create the 270 electoral votes. And the states that mattered before matter now. Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, those are the 3 states that are truly in play. And those states, this is why I think that Governor Shapiro from Pennsylvania would be, in my mind, the obvious choice for the Democrats, because that takes Pennsylvania off the map, and that gives potentially Joe Biden the election.
I want to ask
Kamala Harris. And by the way, how many times will people make that mistake
I'm
over
sure
the coming
a lot.
days?
Sign me up.
Muscle memory is a hard thing to fight.
This is so true. We'll keep dating our checks here with Frank Luntz. The question about process I want to ask you about, because there's already this idea of a smoke-filled back room, even though it's the Vice President of the United States, and whether the Democrats should have some sort of mini primary or some sort of nominating contest that makes it feel like she was vetted. Donald Trump on Truth Social, they stole the race from Biden after he won it in the primaries, a first. These people are the real threat to democracy. He's saying that Democrats have rigged the race again. How do they make this appear like this was not some sort of a deal?
Because it's a coronation.
It is a deal, then.
But it requires someone to say, I want to run. It requires a Wes Moore who came out in favor of her.
Right.
It requires a Cory Booker. I've not heard from him yet. It requires some of these other potential candidates. Gavin Newsom came out for Harris. Someone needs to stand up and say, we need this vote. The only one who's done so at this point is Joe Manchin, and it's unclear whether or not he will run, and Manchin is too conservative for the average Democratic delegate.
Well, he told CBS today he's not running. So then it's just Marianne Williams and I guess no one else at this point.
And she got, 1% of the vote in the primaries? So this would have been an argument 24 hours ago, but if there's no candidate, then there's no election, and this issue goes away.
As we consider the other side of the aisle here, Donald Trump, and now a Trump-Vance ticket, because he had to make this selection of who his vice presidential nominee was going to be before all of this went down. What needs to change for two white men as they compete against potentially a woman of color? How can they attack Kamala Harris without being vilified for it in some sense?
Well, they will be, but that doesn't mean it matters.
So they just treat her like they treated Hillary Clinton in 2016?
It worked for Trump. We forget that. When Trump was elected, she was not, even though she got more popular votes. I think that people are aware of it. But in the end, if you're a working class voter, and more specifically, if you live paycheck to paycheck, you're going to ask yourself, which one of these people know my circumstance and which one of these people can fix my circumstance? It's 25% of the electorate working paycheck to paycheck. The candidate that has the best agenda for those people and seems to empathize with them and understands them. J.D. Vance comes from them. That's who he was. And his language is actually better than Donald Trump's in speaking to them. It's not necessarily inspiring to the corporate community, and particularly the people who watch this show. This is a very educated and a wealthy audience that you have. This is not a J.D. Vance audience. This is not a Donald Trump audience. But the people who do care, does she come across as being flippant? Does she come across as truly understanding and empathizing? Or is she trying to score political points? And this is the one thing that the Democrats have gotten wrong. In times of economic distress, they hear the Democratic message, but they hate it if they think that they're being taken advantage of, if they think it's just a political ploy or partisan trick. And she, in the past, has communicated that a less than forthcoming persona. I remind you, she raised tens of millions of dollars as a candidate in 2020. She didn't even make it to Iowa. So she's had the chance before. She didn't succeed, but this is a new game, a new day, a new office, a new electorate. So I would say to you that everything begins fresh right now.
Well, as you were talking about who's going to appeal to the working class voter that lives paycheck to paycheck, which J.D. Vance obviously tried to do in accepting the nomination. He, of course, grew up in Ohio, but his family was from Kentucky. And we heard from the Kentucky governor, Andy Beshear, about that notion when he spoke on MSNBC's Morning Joe earlier today. This is what he said.
Let me just tell you that J.D. Vance ain't from here. Now, the nerve that he has to call the people of Kentucky, of Eastern Kentucky, lazy. Listen, these are the hardworking coal miners that powered the Industrial Revolution, that created the strongest middle class the world has ever seen, powered us through 2 world wars. We should be thanking them, not calling them lazy.
He, of course, is a Democratic governor in what is a deep red state. Some have suggested he, too, would be a good complement to Kamala Harris as a vice president. But I know you said Shapiro earlier. Would Beshear be just as good of a choice?
No, because he can't bring Kentucky. He barely won his reelection. He does not bring that state over. Kentucky is solidly Republican. He's been successful in winning that state for himself, but he will not win it for the Harris ticket. But he makes a really good point electorally, not in what Vance said, but in how quick people are to respond, to take things out of context, to really jump on, in some cases, badly spoken words, in other cases, twisted words. That's what's going to happen every single day for the next 100 days. And so what are we going to have? An electorate that trusts no one. All this is going to be is point, counterpoint, attack, counterattack for 100 days. And the states in play are going to see this on their computers, on their laptops, on their iPads, on their phones, on the billboards, on the TV ads, on everything. I would not want to be from Pennsylvania, Michigan, or Wisconsin, because you will hate politics by the time this is done.
I only have 30 seconds. I don't want to cut you off. How important is it for Nancy Pelosi to bless this today?
She's going to do it. And Hakeem Jeffries is going to do it. The timing, it doesn't matter. It's not that they're holding out.
Yeah.
It's that people just go quickly and some people go a little bit more slowly. She's the nominee. There is no contest. There is no vote. There is no debate. There's nothing. It's Harris versus Trump, and God help us all.
God help us all, says Frank Luntz, the voice we wanted today. Thank you so much, Frank, for being with us.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Oh, my gosh.
You get the statement from Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi endorsing Vice President Kamala Harris.
Frank Luntz told us it was done, just a matter of time, and that he said would be the case for all parties here. Nancy Pelosi now makes it official.
In part of her statement, she says Kamala Harris, as a woman in politics, is brilliantly astute, and I have full confidence that she will lead us to victory in November. She says in the Democratic Party, our diversity is our strength and our unity is our power. We must now unify and charge forward to resoundingly defeat Donald Trump and enthusiastically elect Kamala Harris as the next president of the United States. She ends the statement, Joe, with onward to victory.
Keeping in mind it was Nancy Pelosi who orchestrated the pressure campaign to get Joe Biden to drop out of this cycle. She may not be the Speaker of the House any longer, but she has been driving this conversation from her own corner. Of course, her protege, Hakeem Jeffries, I suspect will be soon to follow. Then the questions again about Chuck Schumer. With a majority now, we should note, of Democratic senators backing Kamala Harris. The Obamas remain an interesting question mark here, following what some would suggest is a challenged relationship with the Biden family. We'll be curious to see what this means for Kamala Harris. But Kailey, the idea at this point of a contested convention or a mini primary is starting to sound highly unlikely with names like these coming behind the Harris campaign.
Yeah, especially considering that all of those who may have been willing to throw their hats in the race for the nomination,
that's right,
including a number of high-profile Democratic governors, have come out and endorsed Harris. And, of course, now independent Senator Joe Manchin, who we understood yesterday was teasing the notion of re-registering as a Democrat and throwing his hat in the ring, said this morning he would not. Yeah. So even if there were to be a contested convention, it's not clear who exactly wants a contest.
That's correct. Let's bring it to our political panel now. Great to have Rick Davis with us of Stone Court Capital, of course. Bloomberg contributor Jeannie Shanzano at Iona University, our signature panel. Great to have you both here. Jeannie, what's your thought? Nancy Pelosi has spoken. You may not be surprised by what she said, but sometimes it feels differently when it happens. Is this over? Kamala Harris is the nominee.
It is looking closer and closer to being over. I love the fact that Nancy Pelosi listened to you and Kailey, and the minute you called for it, she delivered. And, they are all going to be following suit. You know, I don't think this is out of character for Barack Obama and Michelle Obama. They have not wanted to get ahead of the delegates traditionally in this kind of thing, but they too will follow suit. I think The bigger question here is going to be, do any donors hold back? We've already heard from a few who haven't been forthcoming yet, and they may follow suit as it's clearer and clearer that she is going to be the nominee. But I think as it pertains to elected officials, to your point, Hakeem Jeffries, Chuck Schumer, eventually the Obamas, they will all follow suit, because one thing the Democrats don't have an appetite for is more chaos. They want this resolved, and they want to go forward and try to beat Donald Trump, who they still feel is a threat to democracy. So I think that sort of explains why we're seeing this lineup so quickly. And of course, to Frank's point earlier, you can't beat somebody with nobody, and nobody has stepped forward to challenge Kamala Harris.
Rick, does this risk backfiring on the Democrats? Could this be seen in the eyes of some voters who are already not pleased with the choices that were laid before them in this election, now to have effectively the third choice, the alternate choice, decided for them? Could this be a problem?
No, I think we all need to sort of just check our temperature here. I mean, the reality is this is summer. This is when these kinds of things happen. Usually it's August, not July, but the bottom line is very few people are paying any attention to this presidential campaign at this stage. They now know that Donald Trump's become the nominee of the Republican Party. And because of the blitzkrieg over the weekend, I'd say half the people probably now realize that Joe Biden is not running. It'll take a while for this to sink in. And the reality is people weren't expecting a competition. They weren't bated breath like us waiting for Joe Biden to withdraw his candidacy and open it up to a convention. I mean, these are things we care a lot about, but regular voters don't. They want to offer up, give us your candidates, come after Labor Day, they'll focus in and they'll see what's going on. Remember, I mean, only a little over 20 million people watched Donald Trump's speech at the convention. I mean, this was heralded as the biggest thing. He had just had an assassination attempt. He was going to describe it for the first time on the stage. When John McCain got the nomination in 2008, 80 million people focused in, 55, 60 million more than Donald Trump. Nobody is paying attention to this campaign because they didn't like either of the candidates. They don't like Trump and they don't like Biden. Now they're going to have to figure out, do they like Kamala?
So much for the Hulk Hogan draw. Jeannie, now that we do have Milwaukee behind us, no one's talking about it today, whether they watched it or not, because this is the story right now. Whether you call it a coronation or something else, Kamala Harris has to get on the road and, to Rick's point, start identifying herself and attempting, I guess, to identify her opponent, even though people know a lot about Donald Trump at this point. How does she turn the age issue on him starting now?
First of all, I'm very sad to hear Rick Davis say nobody's paying attention to this. He may be right, but gosh, it's all I'm living and breathing. So it's troubling at the very least. I think what she's got to do is she's got to reintroduce herself to the American people. As vice president, she was handed initially a couple of really difficult tasks. Number one being the border. Number two being the Voting Rights Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And that has not, boded very well for her on both areas. So she needs to, now that she is going to be on the top of this ticket, potentially reintroduce herself. And we already hear what her campaign wants to focus on: reproductive rights and her prosecutorial background. And those are two critically important issues: crime, the issue of security, and the issue of freedom and liberty to do with our bodies what we want. Those are amongst, if you set aside the all-important issue of the economy and inflation, the most important issue on the minds of many voters. And so she needs to focus on those, and she needs to prove her bona fides there, and she needs to distinguish herself from Donald Trump. The more she can make this about Donald Trump, who is now the oldest nominee ever to run for president, the better off for her, because many of his issues are not attractive, and he has never broken through that ceiling of about 45, 47%.
Well, Jeannie, as you talk about Kamala Harris as a prosecutor, can she not only make age an issue in a way that it hasn't been for Donald Trump as much as it was for Joe Biden, but also Donald Trump's conviction on 34 felony counts in the hush money case in New York? We saw Joe Biden attempting to do that in the debate. I think we all know how that went down. By and large, it doesn't seem to have dented Trump's appeal for American voters at all. Can Kamala Harris change that?
She absolutely can. We need to remember the reason she is vice president is because her strong debate against Joe Biden. She is a very good prosecutor and a very good debater. And you could even just go back and look at the clips of her questioning somebody like Brett Kavanaugh from her perch in the Senate. She knows how to prosecute these cases. She does so effectively, and she can do it against Donald Trump. It's going to be fascinating if we get them in the same room and that debate goes forward, hopefully on Bloomberg as opposed to ABC. But if it goes forward on ABC, I'll be watching. But it is going to be fascinating because let's not forget, Donald Trump has had a track record of difficulty against women, and she is a woman who is a formidable debater. She hasn't proven herself to be as great as campaigning, but a very good prosecutor and debater.
Rick, if you were advising Donald Trump's campaign, then with that said, would you allow him on stage with Kamala Harris, or is it imperative that he debate her?
Yeah, I would probably tell him not to debate. He's not a great debater to begin with. If not for the, complete disaster, which was the Joe Biden performance, we'd all be talking about, almost 30 untruths told by Donald Trump at the debate, his aggressive style. I mean, I think that anytime Donald Trump gets in front of another candidate, he can't help himself but go right for the throat. And doing that to Vice President Harris, I think would be very dangerous. The reality is they're playing from a lead. He's already said he doesn't want to debate ABC and that George Stephanopoulos guy. He'd much rather have now this debate in Fox. Sounds to me like a great exit door to kicking the can on a debate. If I were Kamala Harris's team, I'd say, yeah, Fox is great. We'd love to go into your house and show you up. I'd call their cards on it like today.
Wow.
Well, Rick, as you pointed out, we did get a Truth Social post from Donald Trump yesterday who talked about how he was slated to debate Joe Biden on what he calls fake news ABC, the home of George Slopadopoulos, sometime in September. He said, now that Joe has not surprisingly quit the race, I think the debate with whomever the radical left Democrats choose should be held on Fox News rather than the very biased ABC. I guess we'll see where that goes. But while we're talking about other news outlets, it's worth noting that according to Politico, they have just scooped that Future Forward, the flagship super PAC blessed by Joe Biden, received $150 million in new commitments from major Democratic donors in the 24 hours since Biden announced he would step aside. If we're following the money genie, what does that tell you?
That tells us that this thing is pretty much over in terms of her being the nominee. Those are incredibly strong numbers for her and the way in which Joe Biden engineered this endorsement. So the Democrats got to be feeling good. They can't get over their skis on this. Of course, there's a lot of ground cover here. But the money issue and the fact that it looks like she can move into this campaign fairly smoothly and take over the campaign apparatus, that bodes very well for Kamala Harris and the Democrats. And so I think they've got to be looking at that and the 50 million we heard about earlier in the day as a strong endorsement, particularly the small donor money.
All right, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, our great panel with us here, our signature panel on the Monday edition of Balance of Power. I just want to wrap with this, Rick, big picture here. It's something that came from the Florida delegation meeting a bit earlier on today as they coalesced behind Kamala Harris. There was a statement that emerged following their endorsement, and it said that we're running a prosecutor against a convicted felon. Is that in the end how you would frame this contest?
Well, it's one of the ways. I think it's a nice contrast, and it brings back up the low point of Donald Trump's campaign so far was the week after his conviction. So I think Democrats want to get back to having that conversation, and I think that's right. I think this prosecutor's role has multiple values. If she was thinking about it, she'd go down the border and give a speech about how, as a prosecutor, she learned how to get on top of crime and wouldn't allow a single criminal, whether they're, human traffickers or cartels or coming from other countries. Not one criminal is going to cross this border if I'm president. I mean, she can change the tone of this thing with that one credential in a way that nobody else could.
All right, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, Bloomberg Politics contributors, thank you so much for joining us as we try to parse through exactly how this race has been upended in the last 24 hours and what all of this means. Certainly, financial markets are trying to get their heads around that as well.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz. With great questions now, Kailey, assuming this is the case, and boy, it sure seems like it today. Kamala Harris has no challengers. She has the bulk of the Democratic Party behind her with a couple of key exceptions. We're waiting to hear from the Obamas, for instance, and Chuck Schumer, but remarkable number of endorsements just today alone, including state delegations. So the question becomes the messaging that she will pose against Donald Trump, the narrative that she could turn on the age issue, but also on the race issue, with Donald Trump showing in polls that he's been attracting many young black voters, black men, for instance, away from Joe Biden, which has been confounding for the Biden campaign. And you wonder if it stops that narrative dead in its tracks.
Well, this is something I actually asked a pollster for what was the Biden-Harris campaign, Glynda Lake, about last night, whether or not Kamala Harris is the candidate who can bring back some of that coalition, young voters, voters of color, back into the Democratic Party where they had strayed away. And this was her response.
She is exactly the person to bring that coalition together. And it's not just bringing it together, which is a very good question. It's also energizing it. A lot of young people and people of color are thinking, I can stay home on the couch here. I don't have to go to the polls. So energize them, unite them, and energize and unite our side, litigate the case, make a strong case for our accomplishments. She's a great candidate at just the right moment.
Let's add the voice now of Glynda Carr, President, CEO, and co-founder of Higher Heights for America. Glynda, it's great to have you with us today on Bloomberg TV and radio. What is your thought on this?
I mean, this is a pivotal election cycle. We said this before yesterday. And so I think I would say that we're in her first full day as candidate for President Kamala Harris. And so we can have multiple feelings, right? I think people know the direction of where the Democrats are going. We can obviously thank Joe Biden for his service and mourn the loss of his suspension, right? We also can celebrate. Higher Heights is the political home for Black women. We help Black women to vote, run, win, and lead. And over the last 24 hours, it's an opportunity to be excited about the historic nature of a Kamala Harris presidency. But also, we know that as we celebrate, we're going to prepare to support, defend, mobilize, and organize.
Well, Glynda, I'm glad you point out the historic nature of this. Obviously, the United States of America has never had a woman as president, let alone a woman of color. Are you convinced the country is ready for it now?
I need America to believe in the possibilities of a Kamala Harris presidency. Not just because it's a historic, because she sits at the intersection of race and gender, but here is a woman who has run and won and governed on every level of government. She was a local elected official. She was a statewide executive as Attorney General for California. She was a federal elected leader in the U.S. Senate and now is governing as vice president. She is duly qualified for this moment. But listening to my colleague, Glynda Lake, I believe that, her multiple identities is her superpower. In this moment of a divided country, I believe her candidacy and the way she will organize her campaign will build a coalition of voters looking to move this country to higher heights in a moment where we're concerned about rolling back the very rights that my grandmother and mother have fought for on women's rights, human rights, voting rights, and on reproductive rights.
There could be more endorsements coming in the next couple of hours here as CNN reports essentially what we were just talking about here. Chuck Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries to endorse Harris as soon as today, unlocked potentially by Nancy Pelosi's endorsement that will likely lead the way to more. Glynda, I'm taken by the language, the rhetoric we're already hearing in this campaign, and I know that this is nothing new for Kamala Harris. Donald Trump specifically mispronounces her name on purpose, and his campaign is now referring to her. This is from a co-manager of the campaign, not even Donald Trump himself, referring to her as Laughin' Kamala. We heard Cacklin' Kamala coming from Donald Trump on the podium. These tropes, does she acknowledge them or move on?
I think that's the work of organizations like Higher Heights on two fronts, calling out the racism and sexism in this moment, but also the mis and disinformation that has swirled around Kamala Harris. Particularly, there is a portion of this country that has created a politically toxic and racially divisive times. I think most Americans want an election where we are fighting and debating on values, on policies, and on the direction of this country. And I think you're going to see a growing course of not only just Black women, but Americans who are going to call out Trump and his supporters on creating unnecessary, negative attack on Vice President Harris.
Mm-hmm. Well, Glynda, as you talk about the values of this group of voters in particular, what we've been talking about for this entire election cycle is how ultimately the outcome could be just about turnout, about whether voters in key swing states actually show up and cast a vote. What are the values? What are the issues that drive turnout this cycle for this group?
Voters are concerned about the direction of this country, first and foremost. People are ready for a new direction in this country. As it relates to the work of Higher Heights, organizing Black women, when they're fired up, which given what we've seen over the last 24 hours, Black women do not organize themselves to the polls. They also bring their house, their block, their church, their sorority, and their union. I believe that a Kamala Harris presidency will also ignite the possibilities of leadership of young voters and a coalition of voters that come from different parts of this country, social economic backgrounds that have a common goal about making sure that we are creating economically thriving, educated, healthy, and safe community for all Americans. And in this moment, I believe in the possibilities of Black women leading America. We need to have direct conversations with those that we live with and our neighbors about the direction of this country and what the work will need to be done to ensure that we are having a free, fair election where voters can vote for the candidate they believe is best suited in this moment.
Will her record as a prosecutor hurt or help her with the Black community and with the electorate at large?
I think it's important to say the first thing that Vice President Harris said yesterday in her statement was she wants to earn the vote of Americans. And that is her work, to talk about her record, which is broad. Again, I said this is a woman who has run, won, and governed on all levels of government. And she's going to make the case that her portfolio of work, her portfolio of accomplishments, and her vision for this country will create a value-based case of how she's going to earn the votes of Americans across this country.
Glynda, obviously we focused pretty much all of our conversation today on Kamala Harris being a presidential candidate, but I know at Higher Heights you're focused on elevating Black women in all areas of government. What do you expect the trickle-down effect of her candidacy, or potentially we could be talking about her presidency one day, will have for others to follow her?
The late Shirley Chisholm, the first Black woman to serve in Congress, once said, "I have faith in America." I certainly believe that my fellow Americans have wavered in that in the last couple of years, given the turmoil of our democracy. Kamala Harris's candidacy will energize not only Black voters and Black women, but a coalition of voters that will create a wave to elect a very diverse group of candidates that are running across this country, including her ability to support electing 2 Black women to the U.S. Senate. Currently, there have only been 2 Black women elected and serving in the United States House of Representatives in 1992, Carol Moseley Braun being the first Black woman to serve. And it almost took 20 years to have the second, which was Kamala Harris in 2016. We currently have LaFonza Butler from California serving. She was appointed earlier this year. We've never had a Black woman 2 Black women serving at the same time. And we have 2 candidates, current Congresswoman Lisa Blunt Rochester in Delaware and Prince George's executive Angela Alsobrooks in Maryland running. And they're both 2 competitive races that have an opportunity to catapult 2 Black women to the U.S. Senate at the same time.
Well, Glynda, we're glad you could join us today. Glynda Carr of Higher Heights for America PAC, thank you for the insights and what is clearly the best backdrop we're going to get all day here on Bloomberg TV. It's great to have you as part of our conversation.
Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.